Hello everyone and welcome to our session using online team-based learning as a way to engage students in the virtual classroom. My name is Dr. Sofia Barbosa and I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at Brunel University London.
Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Dr. Paul Diotemans and I'm a lecturer in psychology also at Brunel University London.
Hello everyone, my name is Shafina Anas and I'm a lecturer, academic education and a team-based learning facilitator at Brunel University London.
So our session will consist of a little bit of background why we're using TBL in our sessions. Then we'll move on to just give you an idea of what team-based learning is, the learning environment, what our experiences and challenges were using online TBL. And then we're going to give you some data in terms of student engagement and student interaction, as well as student performance. And finally, our reflections and way to move forward. So let's start with the last academic year. In 2019-20, we were running interactive workshops, and these interactive workshops had two parts. They had some didactic content, and then we had some interactive activities mixed with those contents. Most of them were group activities. We were doing some form of TBL, team-based learning, but it really wasn't exactly that. That moved us to reflect and think a little bit about what we were doing, received some feedback from students, and we decided to see what we could improve in terms of the next academic year.
So in this year, in 2020-2021, we had to change our teaching practices due to COVID-19 and moved completely online. So we took this opportunity to use online team-based learning using the LAMP software combined with Zoom, and more about how this worked in practice in a little while. So we really looked at a student-centered approach where the students were really the center of our interactive sessions. But because we moved online, we split the didactic content as pre-work, whether that was a pre-recorded videos or other reading materials and videos that we have for the students to prepare for the session, followed by a session later in the week, which was interactive and collaborative. So here is where we did our activities and we used team-based learning for that. So we did use a flipped teaching approach, and we always put the students at the center of our sessions.
So what is team-based learning? Team-based learning is a collaborative and interactive teaching and learning strategy, which is focused on small group learning. TBL is an evidence-based approach, and empirical studies have shown that TBL improves student engagement, student learning outcomes, as well as motivates students generally. It is a student-centered approach because it allows lecturers to focus on the areas that students find challenging and problematic and concentrate on those specific areas in the actual classroom. Team-based learning can be offered in different modalities, which includes the online TBL. It could be offered in person, face-to-face, and a hybrid model where you could have a mixture of online as well as in person. So just to take you through, provide an overview of the phases in team-based learning. So as Paul mentioned previously, the pre-work is where the traditional lecture or the didactic content of the curriculum and the knowledge elements of the session was provided for the students before the actual session. It was provided via the virtual learning environment. The students are expected to learn this content before they attend the actual session. And when they attend the actual session, they first of all carry out a series of multiple choice questions called the Individual Readiness Assurance Test. The IRAT is where the students kind of test themselves against the prep content that they learned previously. Immediately after the IRAT, students are put into teams and they take the same questions in teams, and this is called the Teams Readiness Assurance Test, where the students would discuss the multiple choice questions and arrive at the answer as a team. Once the TRAT process is over, they're brought back to the main room for a group discussion and burning questions. So the group discussions will enable the lecturer to focus on the questions or the areas where students found it challenging. And the burning questions in TBL enables the students to raise questions where they need further clarifications from their lecturer. Once that phase is over, students are put into their teams again, where they carry out a series of application exercises. And this is where they apply the content that they've gained in the previous phases in a real world, in the real world sense, where they can actually apply the knowledge. Then there are group discussions after each application exercises. And at the end of the session, there is kind of a regroup where there's a wrap up and key messages are shared within the team. So this is how, using the technology, using the LAMS technology and Zoom, we created the TBL lesson online. So the LAM lesson provided us with a sequence where we created the IRAT questions, the TRAT questions, and the application exercises. Just to draw you your attention, the stop gates there are called gates in the LAMS environment, and this helped us to kind of monitor the progress of the teams from one phase to the other. So we ensured that teams moved together from one phase of the TBL to the other. The other thing to draw your attention is to the team setup. So when we set the team up in the LAMS environment, we ensured that the team's engagement based on the previous term kind of gave us some sort of indication on how students should be put into their teams according to their previous engagement. So this is an example where the LAMS gave us real live data to enable us to monitor student engagement. As you can see from this slide, the red boxes indicate, for example, in question 1, group 1, the red boxes indicate that the group 1 selected option D and B incorrectly before they arrived at the correct option A. So this indicated to us the questions that teams generally found difficult. For example, we found that question 5 in this session, most teams spent a longer time arriving at the correct answer. And that enabled the lecturers to focus on the difficult questions and the difficult areas.
So in terms of experiences using online TBL, one of the main things is the number of students. We have a very large cohort and we want to have interactive sessions. So TBL and online TBL in particular seemed to be the most appropriate mode of delivery in terms of teaching session. Another thing that we were considering is whether or not this online TBL could be used across a variety of modules. This is something that we looked at and we used it in level 4 and level 5, but we did not use for all different modules. It may not be suitable for all. It is important that we use it in modules where reflection is necessary, where we can allow for group discussion, group activities, where peer learning is something that is quite relevant, where we want to use a lot of communication skills. And it's also important that the type of exercises that we are using are exercises that can be answered and developed and worked by a team, not by an individual. So there are indeed quite a few modules where we can use online TBL. They can be used in modules that are more didactic, but it is important that we are aware of these things. So one module that we'd like to focus in particular today is PY 1608, Employability Psychology, which is a level 4 module. So the challenges that we found while using online TBL, there are 4 main challenges that we had to face. Technological issues, so managing and engaging with all the different platforms, Zoom that would allow the breakout rooms, and LAM as the software for online TBL. That was something that we had to deal with, but also, there were quite a lot of advantages. The fact that Zoom allows us to pre-assign students into breakout rooms. And then if we had to adjust, we could do that manually afterwards. Another challenge was keeping and having student engagement. So we found that students were reluctant to turn their cameras on, to unmute themselves, and to engage in discussions if it required the spoken word. They would rather use the chat. So it was more a case of keeping students in the same teams as much as possible, which allowed them to start a rapport with the other students and allowed them to start engaging. And at the same time, all of us TBL facilitators, and this includes whether there is an actual facilitator or the lecturer as a TBL facilitator themselves, that we would go to the breakout rooms and engage with the students to answer queries, etc. In terms of pedagogical challenges, this is more to do with making sure that we are using the existing curriculum and the content, and that this is something that we can use in an online format. So we cannot have the same sort of exercises that we would have in person or in other types of online delivery. And then the last challenge is to do with a facilitator role. So being and conducting online TBL requires a lot of things happening at the same time, from organizing the session at the beginning, but also making sure that we are dealing with any troubleshooting that could happen, like the technological issues that I mentioned, and at the same time making sure that the session in itself is engaging and delivered in such a way that's enjoyable by the students.
So if we look then at our student engagement and interaction overall, so in this particular module, employability in psychology, we had 8 team-based learning sessions. And as you can see in this graph, on the y-axis is the number of students that attended and completed the IRAD, and on the x-axis we have the week numbers. So if you see here, if we progress through the term, we see that the blue line, which is the number of students that attended the session, and the red line, which is the students that completed the IRAD, this individual readiness assurance test, is almost identical. We do see that it goes down as we progress through the term, but we see that's a pattern that occurs more often in other modules as well. So we don't think this is specifically linked to team-based learning. What we can say though from this graph is that those students that attended, so the blue line, they showed high level of engagement by completing the IRAD, the red line. So we do see once they attended, they were highly engaged. Now in this figure, in this bar chart, you see on the y-axis, the mean RAD score. So the blue bars indicate the mean score the students got in the IRAD on a weekly basis. And in the red bars, you see the mean RAD score the students got in the TRAD. Now, the pattern that you can see here across those 8 weeks is that the performance in the TRAD on average is always higher than the performance in the IRAD, in the blue bars. However, it's only significant in week 19, 23, and 24. What this does mean is that we do see that because the performance in the TRAD is higher than in the IRAD, it means that these group discussions that students are having when they do these same multiple choice questions again, but now as a team, it does help facilitate and support the students' learning and their understanding of the concepts that they've gone over in their pre-work to consolidate the knowledge they have before they move on to the application exercises. So this teamwork really supports and facilitates their learning. So another thing we can look at is the student engagement and the performance. And in this case, performance, we mean the performance in the assessment. So not the performance in the TBL sessions, but the actual piece of coursework. Now, this module consisted of 2 pieces of coursework. And for this presentation, we're going to look at the first piece of coursework. Now, this was due in week 25, which was the 7th week of the TBL sessions. So for these analysis, we're looking at the engagement of the students in the first 6 TBL sessions. So there are 2 things we can look at. And the first thing is the relationship between the student engagement overall of these 6 sessions. So their total engagement, their total attendance and engagement in the IRAD, and their performance in their coursework. And when we do that, we find a significant positive correlation between the overall student engagement with these 6 sessions and their performance, which means that the more sessions the student attends, the higher their predicted grade will be. Secondly, we can also look at the relationship between the student engagement weekly, so taking into account the engagement in each of these 6 TBL sessions and their overall performance in the coursework. And when we run a multiple linear regression, we find that the model significantly predicts our data and that 18% of the variance is explained. Now, looking at these six TBL weeks, we do see that only the session in week 22 significantly predicts the mark of the coursework. We could explain this by looking at the content of those 6 sessions. Now, each of those 6 sessions contributed to the students' learning and their preparation in order to do the coursework well. However, week 22's topic was specifically about the assessment. So perhaps students saw this as a more direct link between engaging in that session in order to prepare for the assessment. But the key message here is that the more sessions the students attending and the more they engage within these sessions, the higher their predicted grade will be.
And finally, our reflections on how to move forward. So there are 6 main things that we think are quite relevant. First of all is forming teams. These reflections, just to add, they are own reflections and also based on students' feedback throughout the whole of the module. So we think that despite the challenges, it is quite important to use consistent teams across, as that seems to be the better way to have students engaging with the module itself and with the work that they have to do. They establish that rapport with the other students throughout. When that is not possible, of course, we'll adjust, but that would be the ideal situation. Another thing is to actually have an induction TBL session. So prior to actually doing a TBL session, it's important that students understand what it is. And alongside that, it is very important that we also include a TBL contract, and that can be done in a team building exercise. It's important that students themselves, in the teams where we want them to be from the start, they decide what they expect of each other throughout the whole module when they are doing TBL. This is something that they can throughout the module adjust, have a look at, see if it's working well, if it needs some amendments, but it is important that students are accountable and make the other ones in the team accountable for their work. So another thing is students' feedback themselves in terms of the sessions. We need to make sure that the sessions align with what they need. So we are keeping continuous monitoring throughout the whole of the module. Another thing that we had to take into consideration, what would be better, in-person TBL or versus online TBL, and given that we are having the use of TBL for big cohorts, well, what can happen is that in some cases students may not attend, so there might be a disparity in numbers. And we found that if we are using online TBL, that can be very easily adjusted because we can easily move students around between groups, and that is something that might be more complicated when we are doing in-person TBL. So that's something that we need to take into consideration and take forward. Then in terms of the engagement in the sessions, we are counting on the TBL contract that will in itself provide higher engagement in terms of the students. But by setting these expectations for their teams and accountability, that will also have a great contribution. On the other side, we could always, and that's something that we've been doing in the past, we could always go as TBL facilitators into the breakout rooms and see how things are going. That can also be done and should be done to make sure that everyone is working well and there are no queries. And finally, addressing any of the TBL pedagogical challenges, which are more related to the learning outcomes of the module and the assessment that we use for that particular module. We'll need to make sure that all the exercises, be it the readiness assurance test or the AE test, that they are aligned with what the module requires, and that also making sure that it is something that can be done online.
So thank you very much for listening to our presentation about how we used online team-based learning this year as a way to engage with our students in the online classroom. And on this slide, you'll find our email addresses and our Twitter handles. So feel free to get in touch with us, and we love to hear from you and to share good practice. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.